Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PT on ICE Daily Show. My name is Christina Prevett. I am one of our division leads for our pelvic health division. Today, I'm probably going to get a little bit vulnerable with you, talk a little bit about an area of practice that in pelvic health, we are seeing individuals who have had miscarriages. But until I had experienced my own loss, there was so much about this experience that I did not realize. And so, if you all follow me online, you will have heard that I'm currently going through a loss of my third pregnancy. I had a suspected chemical pregnancy at 5.5 weeks. They found a gestational heartbeat, and then I ended up experiencing a pregnancy loss at 7.5 weeks. And that was 3 weeks ago that I got that news. And I am still working through some of the medical management of having a miscarriage, and my loss was fairly early. So, in this episode, what I want to talk about is what happens when individuals have a miscarriage, what are the different types of miscarriage, and then what is the expectation from a management perspective before individuals have a complete resolution of their pregnancy. And then I kind of want to finish it off with what do we do as physiotherapists from a exercise perspective, on a counseling perspective, to help some of these individuals that unfortunately have experienced a loss. I think that this is a topic that is getting talked about a lot more. 1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage. The majority, vast majority of cases are because of a failure or a defect with implantation or a genetic abnormality. For me, it was the latter. So I had a subchorionic hematoma that was greater than 50% of the size of the gestational sac, which meant that I had a very high likelihood of fetal loss, which I did. When we are thinking about miscarriage, it is conceptualized in a variety of different ways. So, a chemical pregnancy is a loss that happens between 5 and 5.5 weeks. So, you have a positive pregnancy test, but you would be unable to see a gestational sac or cardiac pulse of the newly developing fetus that early on. After 6 weeks, it's considered a miscarriage between 6 weeks and 20 weeks. There is kind of subcategories such as an ectopic pregnancy where the implantation happens outside of the uterine wall. So 2 main types that we see talked about are an ectopic pregnancy that gets embedded into the fallopian tube, or a cesarean scar ectopic delivery where the embryo implants in the cesarean scar. And then after 20 weeks of gestation, then that miscarriage becomes a stillborn birth. Medically, all of these things are called threatened abortions, which is like an evacuation or a loss of fetal tissue with or without a fetal heartbeat. Miscarriage is without a fetal heartbeat. Abortion is a selected ending of the pregnancy, within state regulations. When we are thinking that a person has had a miscarriage, usually it is because on an ultrasound, they're unable to find a heartbeat or an individual starts bleeding. So, when pregnancy begins and progresses, especially in the first 6 to 9 weeks, we expect a doubling of a person's HCG and a development of the gestational sac, so that at about 6 to 7 weeks, we are able to find a cardiac pulse. This isn't a heartbeat, but it's the beginning of flutters of electrical activity that will eventually develop into the cardiovascular system. When individuals have a hard time with finding that cardiac pulse, if there is a subchorionic hematoma, which is a blood-filled sac around the uterus, or there is a failure of that doubling, or there's a slower elevation of HCG, these are all risk factors for miscarriage or pregnancy loss. When individuals are experiencing miscarriage, one, it is emotionally devastating. I know I went through a whole slew of emotions, especially when I thought I lost at 5.5 weeks because it was so early, right? I was talking to myself saying, well, a lot of people don't even know that they're pregnant at this point. Um, but that didn't mean that the emotions weren't really heavy. So we're always going to have that emotional side where this is something I've been thinking about this third baby for a really long time. And so it's really devastating when you get excited about this pregnancy and then all of a sudden you're not pregnant anymore. Then there's also the physical and physiological side. And I think that's the part that really surprised me the most as a physical therapist, as somebody who is a researcher in pregnancy. I felt like I'm fairly informed about pregnancy loss. I work with individuals who have had miscarriages in the past, but I did not expect this loss to be as long in the management as it is, and how much follow up was happening to make sure that I was okay. So, when an individual has a confirmed miscarriage, there are three ways that med management can happen. So, there is expectant management, which is a wait and see. So, over like as soon as there is the body registers that there is no cardiac heartbeat, it will start evacuating the tissue. Eventually you will pass the gestational sac, and then the thickening of the endometrial lining of the uterus will start to shed, right? This is not just a period. This is a lot more intense than that. It happens oftentimes in waves, which I didn't realize. Like you have your first kind of big rush of bleeding, but then you can ease off or go to spotting, and then it can kind of rush again. And you kind of go into this undulating pattern as the body starts like flushing out that pregnancy from the uterine wall. And that can take up to 6 weeks, which I didn't realize, right? So this expected management can have 6 weeks. And over time, just like we're seeing this doubling of HCG that we're going to expect in the first 6 to 10 weeks of pregnancy, the reverse should be happening around a very similar timeline where we are half-lifing, we are halving the amount of HCG that individuals experience as they get further away from their loss. And a non pregnant or unable to pass a positive pregnancy test is an HCG level of less than 5. If you are experiencing a loss between 10 and 12 weeks, your HCG can be in the 100,000 range. So, like, I had topped out at 73,000. And now, 3 weeks from my loss, I am just starting to get under 31 or 32,000. So I would definitely still be showing a positive pregnancy test because my HCG is well above 5. So then we kind of just wait. Depending on where you're at, depending on your setting, and depending on your insurance, you can track that HCG. And obviously, you're going to be tracking your bleeding via blood tests. So right now, I started doing blood tests every 2 days to make sure that it was dropping off. And now I'm doing blood work every 5 to 7 days to make sure that I'm still continuing to see that reduction. If that reduction isn't happening, or if you are not bleeding away the gestational sac, etc., that can be where there are risks for retained tissues. Okay. So eventually, without a gestational sac, your body isn't going to continue nourishing that tissue around the endometrial lining, and you can have risk for infection with that retained tissue. And so, some of the things that if you are experiencing a miscarriage, your doctor will tell you to look out for is you are going to experience cramping that is similar to early stages of labor or more, depending on the person. But if it becomes sudden, sharp, or severe pain in the abdomen, you're starting to feel symptoms of fainting or dizziness. You are bleeding so heavily that you are soaking through a maxi pad in an hour, and you're starting to develop a fever. So these are kind of signs and symptoms that you may be having some retained tissue. Retained tissue can also continue to exude HCG, at least temporarily. And so that may be a reason why your HCG is plateauing or not continuing to come down. The only thing with individuals who, like, some people do a miscarriage management where they're just continuing to take positive pregnancy or see if they're getting a positive pregnancy test, is that you're not seeing the absolute amount of HCG like you would in a blood test. You are just seeing, is my HCG above 5, right? So sometimes it's more difficult if you're kind of just doing that positive pregnancy test to see if there's any sort of plateau in HCG. And so you're kind of looking for signs of infection in that instance to see if there's any retained tissue. If you are not starting to see that decline in HCG, that might be a sign of a problem. If that also escalates into infection signs, then that might be a reason why individuals will take you from a wait and see from your miscarriage to a medical or surgical management for miscarriage. So, mifepristone is the medication that is most popularly used for miscarriage management. What it does is it softens the cervix and helps with dilation. That dilation helps to expedite the miscarriage process. And I think it successfully facilitates miscarriage in about 92% of cases. The other management is surgical management, which is a DNC. So essentially, it is a surgical procedure where with a speculum there is a mechanical surgical dilation that happens, and then a moving away or a scraping away of any retained tissue. None of those are great options. They're very devastating, and it can have a lot of trauma on the other side of it because it's very long-winded. You're taking pregnancy tests and it's positive, but you know that you're not pregnant anymore. So this process of trying to watch your HCG levels come down, trying to make sure that nothing is retained, it's really devastating as a person currently going through it. And so I kind of like that's kind of our medical management piece. The next step that I think a lot of people don't recognize is that your pregnancy symptoms, because your HCG still stays elevated, and it can stay elevated for 6 weeks. I've had some people tell me stories that it stayed elevated for 3 to 4 months even with med management, is that you still feel pregnant, right? You are still having symptoms of pregnancy. For weeks, I was still vomiting anytime I smelled coffee, even though I had had a confirmed loss. And I think that emotionally was probably the hardest part because your HCG didn't come down to zero, right? It slowly starts to come down, and you start experiencing symptoms around 6 weeks when your HCG is in that 20 to 30,000 range, right? So you're still going to be experiencing symptoms until your HCG, your estrogen, progesterone drop down below those lower levels, and that can take some time. So when I am now thinking about working with individuals with miscarriage, I probably am going to dive into a little bit more the emotional side if people want to talk about it, talk about their experience with miscarriage, and maybe be a little bit more open to that conversation, because there's a lot of people who reached out to me with me being very open about the medical side and the emotional side of having a fetal loss, about how they felt very alone, how there was really not a lot of information. They didn't know that it was going to be this long, that they were going to experience symptoms for this long. They didn't really know what to expect. Um, and it's because we don't really talk about it. It's kind of a taboo topic. We don't announce pregnancies until 12 weeks because if we experience a loss, we don't want to have to explain that. And I totally get that, right? Like, I told all the people that were really close to me, they knew that I was pregnant because I would want them to be by my side if I had a loss, and they have been. Right. So whoever that support network is for you, I hope that you have that. The final piece of this puzzle, or this kind of like complex scenario, is around return to exercise. Depending on how early you are, from a pelvic floor perspective, we do not have the same issues or considerations as we would if you were postpartum, right? So if you had a vaginal delivery, or you had a stillborn birth over 20 weeks, because the gestational size is different and the stretch injury is different, or you're having surgical management with an abdominal incision. So we're not really thinking as much around some pelvic floor issues. If we have them, we're going to manage them the same way. But a lot of the return to exercise considerations are around cramping and abdominal pain and bleeding severity. So when you're trying to get back to exercise, when we are upright, if we are running, doing more impact, doing more heavy lifting, we can have an increase in bleeding that is around gravity and contraction of the abdominal wall. Right. And so when we are helping clients who are experiencing miscarriage try and figure out return to activity, we're going to be counseling very similar to early postpartum, right? If you're having severe abdominal cramping, if you are having an increase in bleeding that is including an increase in blood clots that are greater than the size, I say a loony because I'm in Canada, but like, an inch in diameter or whatever, that is your sign that you are pushing your body too far for its recovery process right now. And so that is similar from the miscarriage side to the early postpartum side around the abdominal cramping and the bleeding when we're thinking about returning to exercise after loss. For example, I could do some light lifting very early on, but anytime I tried to run, I started having really significant and severe abdominal cramping that would increase my bleeding. So that was when I would stop, halt exercise, bring intensity down, bring heart rate down, cramping would subside, and that was kind of my pushing factor of like, when I start hitting those zones, that is my body that is telling me right now that is going through a miscarriage that I'm pushing it a little bit too hard. And so being able to counsel our clients, who I know for me, exercise is very therapeutic. It is a mental health buffer for me. And I know that I had to lean on a lot of my health strategies to try and, process this grief and try and, my mind was kind of all over the place, and I didn't really know what way was up in a lot of ways. And so I used exercise as a management strategy, but I had to make sure that I knew what my navigational buoys were, especially early on when bleeding is heavier, to make sure that, I'm not going into, dizziness spells or whatever because I'm losing too much blood too quickly, or I'm pushing my body faster than it is ready to go. All right. I hope you all found that helpful. For me, it's been very healing, kind of talking about miscarriage and loss. I know not everybody feels that way. It is a club that I never wanted to be a part of, but it is definitely one from a medical management side. And as a person who felt fairly confident in like the what happens with miscarriage side, there was a lot of things that were very surprising for me, especially the timing, the retaining of pregnancy symptoms, and just how long some of that HCG mechanics can take. So hopefully, I can share my experience, and other, people that you are working with can see some of that benefit of your education and your capacity to kind of stand alongside them. If you are looking to get into our pelvic level 1, level 2, we do not have any course offerings left for 2024, live or online, but we are starting 2025 up and running. January 20th, we are starting both pelvic level 1 and level 2. Level 1 is a prerequisite for taking our level 2 courses, and we are hoping to see you all there. If you are looking for some of the research coming out in pelvic, I feel like we are totally on this precipice of our research taking a boom. Make sure to sign up for our pelvic newsletter. Every 2 weeks, we get 4 to 6 links in your inbox, depending on what's to come out in that time. And you can keep abreast of a lot of the research that is very quickly evolving within the pelvic health space. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season, that you're not too stressed and overwhelmed. My kids have their third snow day because we have about ice and a bunch of snow coming our way. So stay safe if you are on the roads and you are in some of the storm zones, and we will talk to you all soon.